Well, welcome to Cooperative Strategies Flexibly Forward webinar number 3, one we've entitled The Perfect Storm, Guiding Schools Through Financial Turmoil. My name is Scott Stubbins. I am an Executive Director at Cooperative Strategies. I head up our funding group, and I'll be your host this afternoon. Here's our agenda for this afternoon's call. We'll start out with introductions of our webinar participants. I will give a brief description of the current economic picture, including some potential financial impacts that this coronavirus has had on states, as well as talk about some of the changes that we've been seeing on federal policy and some funding updates on that. And then after that brief discussion, we'll begin a Q&A with our panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. And then what we'd like to do is, as the presentation and webinar is continuing, please populate the chat and let us know if you have any questions or topics that you would like to discuss, either amongst the group or with our panelists, and we can kind of work through that group that way. And I will try to keep an eye on the chat, and any questions that I see that we haven't covered or that are interesting, I'll try to make sure that we communicate. Also, we will be recording this meeting and making it public on our YouTube site. So if you know anybody who couldn't join us, or if you'd like to listen to it again, you'll have that opportunity. So first, what I'd like to do is do a brief disclaimer. Because we will be discussing some financial matters, we would like to note that this webinar is intended for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as the basis for financial decisions, and that nothing said on this webinar can or should be viewed as financial advice, and all opinions expressed by Cooperative Strategies or any of our guests are solely our own opinions. As I mentioned, my name is Scott Stubbins. I am Executive Director at Cooperative Strategies. I have with me Ambur Borth, the Assistant Superintendent for Menifee Unified School District in California. And then we're also joined by James Rowan, the Executive Director of the Ohio Association of School Business Officials. I will let them introduce themselves a little later before the Q&A, and they can give you a little bit of their background. But what I'd like to do kind of as we get started here is begin with discussing what's going on in the current economic climate. And I won't take too long here, but I think just to contextualize what we're talking about, what we have now is what is really unprecedented in American history as far as the size and speed of a economic downturn. One of the things that we're trying to figure out and trying to get our hands around still is the potential economic scenarios that are coming out of this coronavirus crisis. Just this morning, we had a real GDP decline of over 4% that was announced, which was greater than anticipated, and I think did not surprise many, but with the speed that it happened, I think nobody was surprised based on what we had seen in economic conditions. I think the question we're all trying to wrap our heads around is how to move forward and what might this look from here going on. And I like this chart here. It's some information from Moodys Analytics and the BEA, talking about a baseline economic scenario and then some other scenarios based on how long it takes for us to recover. And I think what we're finding out is really the economic impact is going to be path dependent about how fast we can return to some sort of normal. And I think what's really interesting about this call today is I think schools have a huge part to play in getting our communities back to normal, because our schools and our educators really are the best of local governance and are really having to serve on the front lines of this crisis and are going to play a large part in enabling not only our kids to get educated again, but enable people to go back to work in whatever ways we can. And so there's a large part for them to play, and you guys to play in helping us get back to some sort of normal. But the longer that this downturn continues and persists, and the longer that people are stayed in their homes, the more protracted this slump is going to be, and the harder it'll be to get back to normal, and the longer that recovery will be. And I think that's what we're contextualizing in this first chart. I think one of the benefits that we had is actually states came in relatively well prepared on a rainy day fund look for this crisis. They had been saving money. They had been doing, in general, states had been doing a nice job of building balances for rainy days. As you can see here in 2018, we were actually at a peak for almost 8% of state expenditures held in rainy day funds across the country. So, states were relatively well prepared, and budgets had been not exactly factoring something like this in, but they were at least better prepared for a shock than they had been in prior times. But I think as we've seen is this crisis has hit everybody, and regardless of how well prepared you were, it's going to have a large impact on operations. And so this analysis by Moodys Analytics I thought was very interesting. It took two scenarios, a moderate stress scenario and a severe stress scenario, and then looks at both of them and compares it against what the impact will be to the percentage of state general fund revenues. And I think what this is trying to get at is the states who have more economically sensitive revenue streams, such as the sales tax that will be immediately impacted, will see the largest impact as a percentage of their general fund revenues getting hit. So what this is intending to do is show where the most pressure is going to be, at least initially. And what we're seeing here is that Alaska, Louisiana, North Dakota, and a lot of these, frankly, are oil states. So they're getting hit with low oil prices, in addition to items like sales tax or income tax declines, with one of the smallest impacts being felt in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Massachusetts, which their funding streams might be more property tax oriented or more stable sources of funding that are otherwise available. So I think this is a list. They've got all 50 states here, they're not individually listed, but it gives you an idea that I think that top 10% there is going to be really affected, almost up to 30%. And then after that, kind of everybody's expecting 10% to 20% of a expected revenue losses as a percentage of general fund revenues, which is a large thing for states to kind of get their heads around. So who's being impacted the most? The industry that we know is being really impacted is certainly leisure and hospitality. And I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the cities that's looking to get back to work fastest is Las Vegas, because they've got almost 30% of their employment is in hospitality and leisure. So as you can imagine, in order for them to get back to a reasonable employment, they've got to get people back in those sectors back to work. So this chart shows just a number of areas that are going to be most impacted by that in those specialty areas as far as percentage of their employment, and another area to kind of take a look at where this will be most deeply felt as far as on a community by community basis. And then I think we want to do a quick summary of what we've seen as far as on the federal side. I think everybody's got a pretty good handle on what has come out of the CARES Act, and by now is hopefully documenting all of their expenses and what they've been spending on any sort of COVID-related expenses and trying to communicate that. What has been particularly interesting is as we've kind of moved through, there has been a noticeable shift, and I think the tweet here referenced is the beginning of a shift towards infrastructure investments and bridge, tunnel, broadband, that kind of stuff. And I'd hope that schools would be a part of that to get legislative fiscal relief, try to get as much help down. There's certainly going to be a push from the federal government and those who are politically savvy. There's obviously incentive for all politicians to do what they can in this time, particularly as we approach election year in November, where they're going to want to be seen as doing everything they possibly can. So I think we're looking at additional stimulus down the line. The question is what it looks like, what it's for, and how they execute it. One of the topics du jour, and actually came out early this week, is we've seen states already starting to reach out to the federal government to ask for additional assistance. I think the first one that we're kind of looking at is Illinois. Their governor has already made some requests to get some additional help and looking for potential federal bailout money. And what is interesting is already we're seeing some pushback on the federal level, particularly from Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, saying that the federal government isn't just going to bail out states, and that states that had large expenses because of coronavirus, but that they consider to be mismanaged before the pandemic hit, they won't just come to the rescue of. And I think this is a bit of a change for those of you who lived through the 2008 crisis in the big chairs. I would consider this to be similar to discussions that happened around Lehman Brothers when they talked about the moral hazard of rescuing everybody. And I'm kind of viewing this as a potential, if you talk about not saving a state like Illinois, is that akin to a situation where you let Lehman Brothers go, and so that other people know that you can't just do what you want. So I think that's one of the things that we're keeping an eye on is how this rhetoric goes between the states and the federal government. I think there's also a political lens to be viewed here, as far as you've got a president who's running for re-election, and you've got a number of states around the country that are going to need help. And how do they determine, in this quote, states that were mismanaged versus well-managed, as this crisis is affecting everybody. So that is an additional thing to keep an eye on, as far as on a state-by-state basis, about kind of who's going to need help first. And I think Illinois is probably the initial one that is going to need help, given that they're really close to a downgrade anyway, and that I think will put additional stress on them. So that's the state I'm keeping my eye on to see kind of what happens on a federal level. And then challenges for pre-K through 12 schools. We've kind of gone over this in some of our other webinars, but I wanted to hit on this one. There really are no good federal programs dedicated to funding health, safe, educationally appropriate physical learning environments in schools. The federal programs that do exist for using funds, facility-rated expenditures, they don't kind of attack the stuff we need right now, as far as Head Start and Impact Aid. And the biggest funder of public school facilities on a federal level is FEMA, and they really only come after a disaster is hit. So the question is if the federal government does want to get involved in helping school infrastructure, do they have the necessary infrastructure in place internally to be able to do what they need to do to get that done? And then just today, the state of California announced that they were looking at potentially reopening schools as early as July or August. And I pulled this quote out of a press release by Tony Thurman, the California Superintendent of Public Education. And I think it was on point as far as the challenges involving schools right now. And when you're thinking about the financial impacts, if this is going to work, can this be done and reopened in a way that protects the health and safety of our students, teachers, and school staff? But additionally, how is this going to impact, schools are going to need additional resources to make this happen, including hiring more teachers potentially. School staff and teachers will need personal protective equipment or cleaning supplies, and then the form of social distancing. Additionally, I think there's been discussions about how to implement busing changes and other things like that. So there's significant changes, and a lot of these come with additional costs that need to be considered as we talk about taking kids back to school. One of the things we are encouraging people to do is be an advocate for additional funding, particularly on infrastructure. This www.buildusschools.org is trying to go out and really make the pledge for pushing the legislators for the need of additional funding from federal level for public schools and grounds, and trying to get that. So I would encourage anybody who can to go on here and sign on to any petitions or letters to these signatories to make a push on the federal level for this additional funding. And then this will be my kind of last slide, but one that we've been kind of kicking around internally at Cooperative Strategies is a framework for kind of approaching this recovery. And what we're calling it is this bridge, reform, transform idea. And right now we're in the bridge stage where we're really just trying to take short-term actions to stabilize the situation until longer-term plans can be made. And I think what's really challenging about this relative to like a situation like 2008 or the housing crisis. The housing crisis, while it did massively impact school budgets and make districts have to make cuts and changes all across the board, it was fairly contained to the financial realm. And while there was some changes that had to be made, a lot of those were just financially related. And now schools are dealing with not only the financial impacts of potentially reduced funding, but additionally dealing with how are we going to educate students remotely at the same time as trying to figure out how we're going to possibly have them come back and have safe spaces for people to do education in new ways. And so I think the challenge we have right now in the school space is, frankly, we can't orient ourselves to what the new normal is because everything is changing so fast. And so what we've been trying to push on everybody is the idea of remaining flexible, be agile as you possibly can, and give yourself the most financial flexibility as you look to move forward, and stay in this kind of short-term idea of stabilizing the situation until we get a better idea of what a long-term recovery can look like. And then you can move forward into sort of the reform idea of establish recovery plans and institute new practices. And I think forums like this and forums that we'll discuss later in the webinar are important steps to institute these best practices and communicate them across the country about what's working and what's not, because I really do think the strength of America is our local governments and our states, and that we're able to try so many different things and see what works and then share that across. And so your communication amongst each other is a critically important piece to us recovering, because we can just share this kind of information and get everybody communicating that as much as we can. And then ideally what we end up is a situation where we can transform, where we have an idea, a better idea of where we're going, and then instituting those longer plans and building resiliency into the system so that we're better prepared for the next kind of crisis that would potentially hit. So seeing that, we'll move on to a Q&A. And I've got some questions here that we've kind of accumulated. But at this time, I would ask that if you have questions or you hear something that's interesting and it pops up, you can populate the chat, and I am keeping an eye on that, and I will make sure to try to gather our ideas in the chat and then ask the questions to our two panelists here. The first is Ambur Borth. She's Assistant Superintendent in Menifee Unified School District in California, and I'll have Ambur introduce herself in a minute. And then we've got Jim Rowan, the Executive Director of the Ohio Association of School Business Officials. And Jim has worn many hats in his years, and I think he's got some great perspectives from many levels that will bring interest. But Ambur, I'll kind of have you unmute yourself if you want to kind of introduce yourself, explain where Menifee is for those in the country who may not understand, and kind of give a brief background.
Sure, great, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. We are a Menifee Union School District. We're located in Riverside County. Our attendance boundaries cross into 4 different cities and over 56 square miles. We are a district that is growing. The city of Menifee, which predominantly makes up the most of our attendance boundaries, is growing at about 2.9% last year. We have seen enrollment growth of about 3%, 3.5% as a matter of fact in this current school year. And so we are able to build facilities and also transition from more of a rural district to a little bit more into a suburban district with a rural feel. So we're a little bit of a mix in that regard, and are not considered a winner under the funding formula for California. So in the state of California, we fund additional dollars per pupil for those students that are unduplicated in free and reduced price meals, foster youth, or our English language learners. We are not considered an average district. Our population is under 50% of those identified students. And so our average student funding is about $8,629 per student. And so with that, I think that's a good idea of Menifee. We're growing K-8, underfunded in the state, and also have a facilities master plan that we're instituting that includes both an addition of a middle school and an elementary school.
Thank you, Ambur, and I look forward to talking about some of the challenges you're facing. Jim, why don't you give an introduction to yourself, and please don't be bashful about talking about some of your past experience.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thanks for having me today on this this webinar. So I'm Jim Rowan. I'm the Executive Director with Ohio ASBO. I've been on the job for just about 4 years. I've spent a career in government, started in the U.S. Navy, spent some time with the State Auditor's Office in Ohio, which is where I got my first introduction to school finance and learning the ins and outs of the financial world. So became a Chief Financial Officer Treasurer in the late 90s, and or actually in the early 90s, and worked my way through a number of different size districts, different challenges. Had a great opportunity to get involved in both my state and national association. I'm a past president of Ohio ASBO 2004, and past president of ASBO International 2007. And after I retired from the public sector in 2011, I became a city manager for about 5 years. And I thought schools were challenging, trying to manage a city and all the challenges of serving a community of 60,000 residents is no easy task either. So crisis management has been something I've dealt with in a number of different capacities, most recently managing our way through this pandemic. But it's an important role. Our association serves our member districts. It's an important role that ASBO International is able to serve our districts as well as our affiliates. And look forward to engaging in some conversation today about what we're trying to do to manage our way through this crisis.
Thanks, Jim. My first question is for Ambur. As you mentioned, you're in the middle of a facilities master plan with some, kind of active construction going on. How has the crisis changed the way you're proceeding with your facilities projects and your master plan?
So we were relatively lucky in the places that we were for our projects. We have several projects that are ongoing. And so with the school closure, of course, and construction considered essential, we were able to continue working with our construction management teams and bringing on and really increasing or attacking our timelines in a little bit of a faster approach and not having to wait until summer school. And so we've continued with some of our smaller projects, installing security cameras, but also we have a reconstruction of a middle school, and that reconstruction was going on while school was in session. And so we've been given the gift of not having students on campus while we now move into a construction phase. And so that has been positive for us. And so we've pushed our timelines forward as much as we possibly can. And then with the new construction, we are still in DSA, Division of State Architect approval phase. And so we have not yet had to adjust for that slower growth that we're anticipating due to the recession in our student population, and possibly might postpone the opening of those schools depending upon how we see growth develop in the next school year or two.
Nice. Jim, as somebody who's working with a number of districts, and what are you doing at OASBO to help foster communication with your membership and like the political decision makers that are looking for good information on schools?
Yeah, so one of the things that we implemented, we're in our first year, and we actually modeled this off of ASBO International on the Global School Business Network, is we subscribe to a higher logic platform. In our online community, it's called Collaborate. And it's something that we kicked off about a year ago to get our members engaged in ongoing communication in the various communities, whether it's legislative, education, finance, all member communities. But when this pandemic hit, we created a special community, a COVID-19 community, where we were able to immediately gather questions from the field and added representatives from our state agencies, the state auditor's office, as well as the Department of Education, to be able to respond to questions as they come in. Because there's a lot of questions out there as it relates to funding, waivers, how do you deal with some of the catastrophic cost, forecasting, a host of issues. So by having one central place for our members to be able to communicate and collaborate and share best practices and share ideas, it allows our members to every day check that feed and see what's new. And of course, we sit on a number of different Zoom meetings each week. I have a weekly meeting with the state superintendent's office where we get updates. The finance department within the Department of Education are on weekly meetings. I try to meet at least weekly with some segment of our membership, whether it's a regional meeting or a statewide committee, just to keep them up to date and hear their concerns and make sure that we're responding to them as quickly as possible. So it's been a real benefit for us to have that community to be able to share those ideas back and forth.
And then Jim, as somebody who kind of watches that chat room and those communications that go out, it has been a really enlightening and a great source of information, just really quickly to see like what's going on and kind of where where policymakers' heads are at, or where the different professionals' heads are at. It's been a nice resource, I think, for everybody who's been able to access it. Ambur, what are you using to kind of keep up with the changes going on in California and around the country?
You know, I am luckily also an ASBO member, and so I do tune in and look at all of the communication that goes on within ASBO. I also am able to participate with our Riverside County LEA, so local educational agency conference calls. We have those weekly, and of course monitor the communication that we receive from CASBO, AXA, our California School Boards Association. Continuously monitor also the White House, CDC, California Public Health Department, probably the same things at which my counterparts are doing, is just trying to stay on top of information, read about what's happening in the market. We are a school district that fund a lot of our facilities project with local dollars. And so we are looking to sell bonds here shortly and really trying to encounter what might happen in the market. So catching up with Moodys and making sure that we're on top of all of the economics that are happening and how we can anticipate how that might impact us financially as we move forward with our facilities, but also financially as a school district in the state of California, and what might we anticipate as we move forward to adopt our budgets here at the end of June.
So Ambur, to follow on that, how are you looking at approaching your next operating budget? Like, what are you kind of looking at in order to be able to put that together and then get an idea about how to move forward as we go?
So yeah, it's really a challenging environment. We had our governor come out with a proposal in January of a cost of living adjustment that then would fund the way in which we receive our state funds. And then we received guidance that we really need to project at a 0% cost of living adjustment, or possibly a negative COLA, or in next year, 2021, and then the following year. And so we presented 3 different scenarios with a 1% COLA, a 0% COLA, and a negative COLA. In the worst case scenario, that impacts our school district by over $27 million of revenue lost over 3 years. It's exacerbated because we also pulled back on our enrollment growth. We saw that we didn't grow. We flatlined in our enrollment last time we had a recession, and anticipated a minimal growth in that regard. But then today, because the COLA is a formula that is based on economic indicators that predominantly happened prior to the pandemic, we saw the cost of living adjustment come out slightly higher than what the governor announced in January. And so really we're waiting. In the state of California, we've postponed our personal income tax receipts at the state level until July. And so we're anticipating once the state really has a full comprehension of what the revenues are, then they will adjust. The Department of Finance has the opportunity or ability to adjust the funded COLA. And so while it looks good and rosy right now, we're anticipating that the information to be worse than what we saw. It was just a formula, the COLA, prior to the pandemic, and we're preparing for a 0 to -% COLA, which is challenging in the environment because it seems like our cost of living should be higher based on the formula that creates that cost of living adjustment.
Well, that sounds like a real challenge, and probably something that a lot of the folks on this call and webinar are familiar with what's going on, because I think everybody's dealing with that great amount of uncertainty. Jim, as somebody who kind of has their ear to the ground in Ohio, what are some of the common questions or concerns you're hearing from people in your membership there?
You know, budget's a big thing right now. We require 5-year forecasts in Ohio to be filed each May and each November. So we're gearing up for our May filing, and there's a lot of anxiety right now as to what's going to happen as it relates to any potential cuts this year and into next year. So we hear some concerns there, trying to get some guidance from the department. They recently announced a 20% reduction in agency budgets at the state level, but that has not been a direction for public schools yet. However, we are anticipating, since roughly half half the amount of shortfall that we're looking at in the state is going to be eaten up with our rainy day fund. There's going to have to be something to give us as a result of this. So it's a matter of what's the cut we're looking at for this year. I was on a call yesterday with the state auditor's office, and their advice is we probably ought to be thinking about at least modeling a 20% cut in state funding next year. Concerns over what the potential delinquencies may be like in the housing or the real estate market. They've been deferring some of the income tax payments. So what that's going to do to school districts that rely on income tax coming in. So those are a lot of the financial questions that we get. Then we also get a lot of operational questions. Some of our business managers that are planning transportation routes for next year. How do you route your bus routes and promote social distancing? What does that look like? How do you deal with the shortfalls in the food and nutrition area as a result of continuing to pay staff but not producing any kind of income? So those are a lot of things that we field from the treasurers and the business officials out there. A lot of concern around audit. What are you going to be looking for in the audit next year as we continue to pay people for doing a fraction of what they would normally do? And the message has been document, and go back to the governing authority and make sure that they're approving all the actions you're taking, so that when those auditors come in, they have some authority there to base their audit on. So those are some of the things that we're hearing about.
No, I think that busing challenge is one that I think is particularly interesting about how to work our way around social distancing and busing, and as we try to get back to schools. Amber, I think we had talked before the call, and one of the things that you had mentioned is you had dealt with maybe an unexpected challenge, a challenge that you didn't think you were going to have to deal with in this COVID crisis, but then has kind of made you guys have to reassess and adjust on the fly. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. So I can share that initially, as we talked as a cabinet, is how we adjust to school closure. Because we are not a high poverty area, we didn't initially think that we were going to need to feed our community. And then as we reassessed and heard the information that was coming out, it was really a need that we should apply. We did have the summer feeding program last year. It was a loss for us, but nonetheless, we needed to apply and continue to feed our community. And so we took a couple of days after the closure and started feeding our community on a Wednesday, and really saw high demand. We were feeding over 900 people, which for us was more than we had anticipated. In the summer, we fed about 200 on a daily basis. And now that's tapered off a bit as the weeks have gone on. But we did have to react rather quickly to be able to feed our community. And now our county has identified all of the locations on a map so that our community can really look to see where they can go for support should it be needed. We have been lucky in that our staff have been volunteering to come in. We're doing it on a rotationalized basis as who wants to come in within our nutrition services department. And they are all coming in. But, as Jim said, we are operating at a loss. We're losing over $200,000 a month currently to be able to feed our community. And that, of course, we're documenting, and we have applied for the federal waiver. But it make those fiscal challenges and cash flow issues all the more real as we move forward in our budget projections and cash flow analysis.
I can imagine. I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions for the group, go ahead and populate them in the chat, and we'll kind of keep track and ask anything that kind of comes up. Question I received before was, and I'll kind of open this up to both of you, probably Jim first and then Amber. What do you think the challenges might be if schools end up getting federal funding for facilities, but not any help for operations? And so they end up doing some fixes on the facilities to get that upgraded, but they don't get any help on the operating side. And how might that hurt visibility where you have taxpayers who might be saying, well, you got all this federal money, but it's not the kind of money that you can use for day-to-day operations?
Well, I think, you know, probably the most important thing is just to keep those open lines of communication with your community, making sure that you're transparent with everything that's going on. It's difficult. You know, even those districts out there trying to sell issues, tax issues right now. We had an election yesterday. Some schools were successful, others weren't. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now. So yes, that's definitely a challenge for districts that are having operational problems, but continue to get funding on the facility side. Not to say that the facilities aren't needed or the improvements aren't needed, but sometimes keeping the lights on and keeping teachers employed with the focus being on educating students being the #1 priority, sometimes that can be a little challenging. But my suggestion would be is just making sure that you keep those lines of communication open with your community, be very transparent, and hopefully you can manage your way through that process.
Yeah, Amber, do you have what would be your response if you got a lot of facilities funding but no operating funding? And how do you think your community would respond?
You know, I think that would really pose a challenge if we receive funding for facilities and none for operations. The facilities funding, of course, would be welcomed. As a district that really didn't receive much state funding for our facilities, it would be beneficial. And I'm assuming that those funds would be to help promote social distancing. But as alluded to earlier, that would include a cost increase for teaching staff. And we don't have that now. And if we're looking at a reduction to our budgets, we would definitely need to be able to have a funding stream to promote social distancing in the classroom, as well as structurally, but just with the staff that would be needed on hand, it would be very difficult for us to be able to do that. And unfortunately, then that would lead to continued distance learning, which isn't going to help with our really reinvigorating the economy. We really need to get people back to work. And so I think that the two really should go hand in hand, and it would be something that we would most definitely advocate for.
No, that makes sense. And then, Jim, I think one of the questions that comes out of that is, Jim, based on the recent election just yesterday in Ohio, have you been able to glean any information from people's willingness to pass school issues, whether at a greater rate or a lesser rate than what we've seen in the past? And how do you think the voting populace feels about the situation right now?
You know, I haven't had a chance to really study the overall results of yesterday's race, but just in reviewing the TV news coverage, I was actually surprised at the number of issues that we're passing, considering the amount of uncertainty that we face. And even those districts that lost by a lot in the last election, we saw them make up some ground. So, you know, I think it goes back to, at the end of the day, if you've got a value proposition that you can give your community and they can see value in what you're asking for, sometimes it doesn't necessarily come down to the ask. I mean, yes, how much you ask for is going to impact some taxpayers. At the end of the day, they just want to make sure that their funding is being spent in a fiscally responsible manner. There's value for what they're investing in, and there's a sense of transparency and accountability. And I think as long as that continues, you're going to see districts be successful, even in times of uncertainty.
And Amber, I know California got kind of caught in the unfortunate circumstance of their election for a lot of the school funding in the spring was right at the time when the COVID crisis really started to hit. And we saw kind of record underperformance of schools relative to what they normally do on the ballot. And so has there been any discussions that you've heard of or been talking about kind of where the populace is headed in the California area?
You know, I haven't followed it too closely. We, of course, at our district have had our GO bond, and we were really hoping for state funding should the measure for facilities. It was Prop 13, which in California has a stigma to it, and so perhaps it didn't pass because of the prop number we have thought. Because overall, it looks as if the voter population, they really were supportive of funding for schools and for facilities, and yet it didn't pass. It wasn't something that was successful when the voters went to vote. And so I think that what I've read about, what I've seen, of course, prior to COVID-19, is really trying to reinvigorate the marketing campaign for school facilities and trying to get something else on the ballot. And I think now with COVID-19, we really need to continue to focus on our facilities in California. We haven't received any state funding for several years. And it would be something, if the voters would vote in, would be beneficial for a lot of the school districts within the state. But I think for us, that Prop 13 failed, and we need to re-look at our marketing, because it did test as something that might possibly pass, and yet did not.
Yeah, and I do think that suffered from really unfortunate timing as far as when it hit. Hopefully, that we can get a better result somewhere down the line. Jim, as somebody who's been worn as many hats as you've worn, what would be your advice for districts trying to manage through this this environment and these challenges?
Well, the great thing about the school business profession is the network, the sense of family. I see it every day. I see it in local communities where you have a county of school business officials of maybe 8 or 10 who get on weekly calls. That is grown in Southwest Ohio to about 45 or 50. They have a standing call every Thursday that I participate in. You've got the state. You've got the state network. You've got the national network. I'm going to be on a call next Monday with the executive directors throughout the U.S. To be able to talk through these issues and to see what they're doing. What are their plans to reopen? What are some of the challenges they're facing? What are some of the solutions that they found? And be able to turn around and share that on a regional or a statewide or a national basis is priceless. So to be able to turn to our network of professionals in a time like this, and to be able to share best practices and keep lines of communication open. It's a no judgment zone. There's no dumb question out there. So that's been my greatest experience since becoming a school business official, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to serve on my state and national board, is to continue that sense of family, that sense of camaraderie. And we work well together. We communicate well together. We're all in this together. And it's an unbelievable network.
No, I concur. Having been to a number of your conferences, it seems to be a very family-ish affair as far as the way everybody greets each other and has fun and communicates their ideas and shares what they're learning. It's a very open and good environment that you guys have created there. Ambur, I think one of my questions for you is, as you look out, I think you've discussed the challenges over the next few months. What are some of your bigger concerns as you look out maybe a little further over the horizon, maybe 1 to 2 years, about trying to guide your district through and trying to make it resilient for what we're dealing with?
I think for us, in looking at the long term, or the really that transformation into what our new normal is going to be, is really looking at a combination of things. First and foremost, I'm a chief business official. I focus on finance, and I want to make sure that Menifee has the ability to be able to support all of the priorities of our board and community, and to do so knowing that we are underfunded when compared to our just the state average district finances. We don't receive the same finance because we're a K-8 and because we don't have the same student population. And so really trying to make sure that we weather the storm financially, looking at our enrollment trends, and having enough cash on hand to be able to support the daily operations and payroll. But, and that is a multi-year approach, because we don't quite yet know the impact of COVID-19 and this particular financial storm. And then also looking at the impact that could have on our facilities. As I stated before, we have a GO bond and we have some local funding, and we're really in the midst of preparing to build new schools and to make sure that those new schools are prepared for the new normal. if we're going to continue with distance learning, if we're going to have smaller class sizes, to get ahead of that now as we work through the design of those schools. I think also within the 1 to 2 year timeframe, looking at perhaps changing the model of which we do transportation. We do transport just our special ed students in our district. And so all of our buses are small. And if we were to maintain social distancing in the near term, or even in the long term for that matter, that would increase costs significantly. So really looking at not just brick and mortar, but also staffing and fiscal implications as we move toward that transformation in the 1 to 2 years of our new normal. And if that includes distance learning, how can we best support that with the staff and the buildings that we have?
Now that makes sense, and it sounds like a challenge that a lot of folks are going to be dealing with. Amber, one kind of as we're nearing the end, a specific question for you, I think that is interesting is, CalPERS has always been kind of on the forefront of pension changes around the country. They're one of the largest, if not the largest, pension fund out there. And I've heard it said by many that when CalPERS moves, the rest of the pension industry listens. And I think one of the things that I think it has been downplayed somewhat during this crisis, but I think in the next few months could come back, is the effect that this is having on the pension funding and what that might mean on those states that are underfunded as far as pensions. And I was wondering if you'd heard any information yet. I don't know that they've had to report numbers, so I don't know if it's kind of come to a head yet, but I don't know if you've heard any sort of activity coming from there as the pensions about what that could mean going forward.
So I have not yet. Unfortunately, the PERS rates are about a year behind. And so we did have updated PERS information shared with us on the 17th of April. And because that was the actuarial study and the revised rates were pre-COVID-19, we actually saw the CalPERS reduce the request from school districts for contribution. And what we learned is that the investment losses that we're anticipating in CalPERS is amortized over at least 5 years. And so this loss, if this financial crisis is for 1 year or maybe 2 years, that's going to take a significant hit to the PERS funded plan and the ability for school districts to be flexible with our financial dollars that we receive in a cost of living only environment from the state. And so I would suspect that next year, once we really see the impact that PERS will have and the losses that they're experiencing, that could significantly impact school district financing. We have looked at several reports and several charts and graphs. I can't share my screen with you, but I can say that we do anticipate PERS rates to go down at this point next year. I mean, the contribution for us to go up. But that would be an impact that we would see next year after the study. They're about a year behind.
Got it. No, that's helpful, and I appreciate that perspective. I got one question from the chat asking from Susan Miller: are there sensitivities in Ohio or California for funding if students with asthma or other immunity challenges stay home? So if you've got some of your population that can't go back to school because it's just not a safe environment for them, giving some pre-existing conditions, how are you thinking about how it measures seat time? Has there been any thought to what funding might look like if those kids can't get back, and how you might be remotely teaching them? And I'll open up to either one of you if you think.
Well, I don't necessarily have a specific response. It's not something we really talked about. However, there's been a lot of conversation about what if we're not able to return to school? What does that look like? We've kind of transitioned into Ohio, getting away from the school day to school hours. I assume there's going to be some sort of provision for those students that aren't able to make it. Or now that we're into virtual learning like we've never been into before, I could see the potential future being a different way to deliver instruction. I know there's been some conversation around, while brief, about getting away from having to accelerate in a given year where you start to accelerate more based on your learning and your performance. So it may not be necessarily grade level. So I think anything's open and anything's possible for the future as we think about coming out of this pandemic and what learning looks like in the future. I will tell you from my perspective, one of the major things we do from an association is provide professional development and training. And we have been a very active face-to-face deliverer of professional development, but we are now starting to think how we're going to do things differently. The number of people that want to be able to stay at home and attend our training through streaming or webinars or through our LMS system is definitely going to change the way we do business. So I got to believe that the educators at the Department of Education are probably already starting to think about what this looks like in the future. But I appreciate the question, and it's something I'll add to my list to ask my state superintendent in my Monday conference call to see what thoughts are around this particular subject.
And Scott, if I can join in as well, I can, almost echo that. I know what we have talked about in California, we are funded on an average daily attendance. And so it's the percentage that a student attends school. And we've talked about perhaps going back to being funded based on enrollment. And that would be something that the state would need to make the determination of, but really seeing and anticipating if there would be conversations and advocating for just that, is that we would be funded based on our enrollment so that those students can continue to have distance or virtual learning supported by our teachers and staff and curriculum, but that we would still continue to receive funding to be able to support that student at home while they learn.
No, thank you for that perspective, both of you. That's really good. We're nearing time here, and I just wanted to kind of give both Amber and Jim, if you had kind of any last message you wanted to send to the group or anything you wanted to communicate at this time. I'll kind of, Jim, you can go first, and then Amber about, kind of a message to share with before we go.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Scott, for inviting me today. I think as we look at our future, we're going to have to revisit crisis management planning. We actually teach a course, and part of that course in risk management is dealing with active shooter and dealing with various crisis scenarios. And I think this is just going to be another example of something that we're going to have to add to our list, develop a crisis plan around this, should this pandemic either return or face another one in the future. From thinking about stocking masks to sanitizer to social distancing, virtual learning. I think what we're going through right now is going to change the way we do business, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And it's going to start to think about how we practice scenarios that we may face again in the future. So I welcome the challenge. I look forward to working with my colleagues and brainstorming best practices as we go forward. But this too shall pass, and we will get through this, and we'll be stronger than ever. And look forward to better days ahead.
Thank you, Jim. Amber, you want to share something?
Sure, I will actually. And I also want to say thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to participate today. And I want to thank you for having these webinars for us, and really thank the community that we serve and the community of all of us in school business that really have come together during the crisis to support one another, to hear challenges that we have throughout the nation, to really use that ASBO platform or this platform, or maybe even another platform in which we can share ideas and support one another as we move through and figure out the best thing that we can do as we try to support our students and our communities as we move through the pandemic. And so I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I really want to thank the community that was participating today for their participation in this event. So thank you.
Well, I wanted to say special thank you to Amber and Jim for their participation. I really appreciate their insights and their giving their time so generously. And I really want to express my appreciation for all school professionals who are, I think, on the front line. You guys are on the front lines, but you don't get credit for it because you're dealing with all sorts of things that are trying to help either feed our communities or are trying to prepare for us to be able to return to normal. And I think that goes underrated. And being on the front line looks like different things in different places. And I think people sometimes forget that schools really are the basic form of local government and really where communities are formed. And at this time, we need our schools to be as strong as they've ever been because our communities need to gather together and be as strong as they've ever been. And so I appreciate you guys. I appreciate everything that all of you do. I do want to mention that if you have any topics for future webinars, you feel free to send them to us. We are on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And then additionally, we have been recording this. So if you missed and maybe joined in late or wanted to review it, we will be putting that on our public YouTube page, and that'll be available then. But thank you all for attending. I appreciate all of you. And thanks again, Jim and Amber, for your insights and your openness. And have a good day, everybody. Take care.